Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 135, Meno 94e to 95a. Socrates has just concluded that arete, virtue, is not something teachable. Platonists will tell you that in Meno, Plato says that virtue is teachable. This isn't a problem because they would say that here Socrates is being ironic. This is the good thing about Platonism. You can choose when Socrates, the speaker for Plato, is being ironic and when he is being serious. When we stop assuming that Socrates speaks for Plato and he isn't always ironic or serious, then we have to start thinking. What has Socrates actually done and why? Members of the audience, in particular Meno, will assume that Socrates has proved that virtue cannot be taught. He will assume that Socrates has simply eliminated one of the original options Meno had presented him with at the beginning of the dialogue. However, as we came to see during the course of the discussion in the earlier part of the dialogue, Meno had in mind the virtue of a man which involves running a city, while Socrates specifically said to Anytus that Meno wanted to learn the sort of arete which an Athenian has, which involves honoring parents and being able to host xenoi in an acceptable manner. And all of this sounds like simply learning how to be a traditionally decent citizen. Socrates brings as evidence four of the greatest statesmen, or the most famous statesmen of Athens, and shows that they did actually teach their sons as much as they could. They found teachers for all sorts of things, all sorts of technai, but for this one particular techne, arete, how to be a decent person, how to be a good Athenian citizen, they failed. They all failed. Had there been a way to teach this arete, they would no doubt have tried to teach it, and their sons, who were clearly able to learn because they were very good at horse riding and other such things, they would have become decent. Therefore, this all proves that virtue is unteachable. And this works because Anytus agrees with Socrates, first of all, that the four statesmen were good and that their sons were not good Athenian citizens. What Anytus seems not to have noticed is that the statesmen did manage to teach their sons to be good at a lot of different technai. And if you're good at a particular techne, such as horse riding, you then are agathos at it. You are good at it. And therefore you have the arete of horse riding. In other words, arete is something teachable. Thus, in the very argument supposedly proving that virtue is not something teachable, Socrates shows that arete, or virtue, is something teachable, and it depends on the sort of virtue you're talking about. What do you want someone to be good at? In other words, it isn't good enough to talk about arete without qualification. It needs to be specified, not what arete itself is, because we know that arete itself is simply the characteristic of someone good, but rather the field in which we want someone to have this arete. And Socrates did say this at the beginning when he said that Meno wanted to learn how to respect parents and host xenoi. But the examples Socrates gave during his proof were not people renowned for honoring their parents or hosting xenoi, but for serving their country, Athens. We could be generous and say that Socrates is talking here as Meno was talking at the beginning of the dialogue about arete politicae or techne politicae, the art of proper behavior in a polis. A crucial problem with Socrates' argument is that even if there is currently no way to teach this arete, it does not mean necessarily that this arete is something which cannot be taught. All in all, this argument is much like all the other arguments Socrates has given in this dialogue, in that it is quite bad. The big difference in this argument is that Meno is not participating. There were places where he could have stepped in and objected. For example, when Socrates said that Meno was actually looking for someone to teach him this arete, which was untrue. But in general, it seems that this argument was tailored to Anytus in such a way that it would run smoothly and Meno could listen and enjoy it without participating. As for Anytus himself, he suffers what we hear usually happens to people who talk to Socrates. He has an idea, he thinks he knows something, and Socrates refutes it, and that's it. That's the end of the conversation with Anytus. It's as if Socrates uses Anytus to prove for the last time to Meno that virtue is something which cannot be taught, which, as we have seen, is already a problematic conclusion. I said that that's the end of the conversation with Anytus, but Anytus has a few words in parting. O Socrates, radios moidokes kakos legen anthropus. O Socrates, easily you seem to me to speak badly about people. In other words, you slander people far too easily. Ego men un an soi sumbulius saimi, e thelese moi pethestai, iula bestai. I would counsel you then, if you are prepared to be persuaded by me, to take care. Os issos men caen alle pole raon estin kakos poien anthropus eu entedete cae panu, oimaidese cae auton e denai. Just as it's probably easier in another city to harm men than to benefit, so too in this city, absolutely. And I think you yourself know this. Here is Anytus, the decent citizen, stating that it is easier to harm than to benefit people. He says perhaps this is the case in another city, but in Athens it is absolutely the case. Anytus's threats are probably intended to make us remember that Anytus was behind the accusations against Socrates, which led to the death of Socrates. But so far as this dialogue is concerned, it's worth noting an expression Anytus uses here, which he has used previously, and that is, if you are willing to be persuaded by me. Earlier he had said about anybody who wants to learn something from an Athenian that they would if they were willing to be persuaded by the Athenian. And what is it that Anytus is prepared to tell Socrates? Some advice. He's prepared to give him some advice. I would counsel you, if you are willing to be persuaded by me, to take care. It would seem then that for Anytus, the way a decent Athenian citizen educates other people is by giving them sage advice, by telling them what to do, what not to do in the field of politics. It isn't a good idea to do what Socrates does and annoy all of the decent Athenian citizens. For anyone aspiring to climb high in Athenian politics, this is good advice, and ignoring it, as Socrates does, may lead to a court appearance and possibly exile, or even, as in the case of Socrates, death. We should also note that this advice has nothing to do with honouring parents or knowing how to host xenoi properly. This is all to do with how to improve one's status in Athenian politics. As so often, we shouldn't be confused by the portrayal of something by Socrates, but rather we should look at the actual behavior of the people Socrates talks to. Anytus is not necessarily a stupid, reactionary, old-fashioned Athenian who despises sophists. He is a realist who knows how Athenian politics work, and he can see that the sophists who claim to teach politicae arete don't know what they're talking about. They have theories, but he has experience. He and others like him are far more likely to help people who want to be good at Athenian politics than these upstart sophists who are normally foreigners, which actually ties in with the subject of xenoi. Anytus welcomes xenoi who are useful politically. The sophists were welcomed into Athens by certain people as xenoi, guests, but those were Athenians who wanted to show off their status, their ability to entertain sophists and appear to the public to be people who are connected with intellectuals. Anytus has a deep distrust of intellectuals, including Socrates.